Hey guys, tonight we slip back through time, not into the cozy candlelit corners of history, but into the less comfortable bits, the ones with stocks, with public humiliation, with justice that probably seemed totally normal back then, but sounds mildly horrifying now. Imagine this, you're stuck in a wooden frame, wrists and ankles locked, face sunburned, legs cramping, and someone's goat just sneezed directly on your foot. Welcome to a sleepy stroll through brutal punishments in the ancient world. Don't worry, you're not actually going to be punished, but you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes as a peasant under some of these laws. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and what time you're listening in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy history club reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a dusty village square, perhaps in 13th century England, perhaps in a slightly sanitized version of it so you can at least wear shoes. The morning is brisk, a rooster is confused about time again, and there in the middle of the square sits the community's favorite piece of furniture, the pillory. Not to be confused with stocks, although let's be honest, both involve unfortunate wooden furniture and a lot of staring. The pillory holds your head and hands upright, a kind of human billboard for bad decisions. The stocks, though, clamp your feet, leaving you sitting uncomfortably while kids throw turnips at you. If you're really lucky, it's only turnips. Occasionally, people get creative rotten fish, moldy bread, passive-aggressive poetry. Both punishments were delightfully public. You weren't just being disciplined, you were being displayed like a cautionary tale wrapped in embarrassment. Forgot to pay your taxes, stealing eggs, slandered the local miller. Congratulations, enjoy a full day of being mocked by everyone, including the neighborhood goose. It's not that people loved cruelty for its own sake. Well, maybe a little, but these punishments were rooted in community enforcement. The pain wasn't just physical, it was social. Your punishment came with commentary, usually unsolicited, and if your cousin's friend's sister caught you in the pillory, oh, your reputation just packed up and left the village. One mainstream fact you might not know, these weren't always reserved for serious crimes. Sometimes people were locked up for scolding, yes, literally for being a bit too mouthy. The medieval world really didn't love sass, but then there were the fringe moments. In one English village, it's rumored they once stuck a guy in the stocks for pretending to be a ghost. Yes, apparently medieval prank culture had boundaries, and spectral impersonation crossed the line. Historians still argue whether this ghost incident was apocryphal, a misunderstood metaphor, or the world's first anti-Halloween law. Now, you might be wondering, how did this end? Did people eventually decide, maybe the public humiliation approach isn't ideal? Sort of. By the 18th century, Western Europe started leaning into prisons and fines instead. Public punishment fell out of fashion, and the stocks slowly retired into museum corners, their only torment now being the occasional tourist selfie. And yet, the vibe never fully disappeared. You can still feel echoes of it in modern public shaming culture, less wooden planks, more internet comment sections. The methods change, but the social sting remains strangely familiar. You stroll away from the pillory now, brushing the imagined splinters from your arms. The morning sun filters through narrow thatched roof alleys, casting long, sleepy shadows. It's just you, your thoughts, and the faint sound of someone else definitely about to be accused of idle loafing. And in your mind, you start wondering, what if you'd lived here? How long before your sarcasm got you stuck in the pillory? Be honest. You wander farther from the sleepy village square, and the cobbled path gives way to dry earth, cracked and sun-baked, dotted with tufts of scrub. The landscape shifts beneath your feet, backward now, through centuries, and sideways across empires. You blink, and you're somewhere older, hotter, Harsher, you're in the middle of the ancient Near East, standing uncomfortably close to one of history's most famously thorough rulebooks, the Code of Hammurabi. The stone stele looms above you, covered in tiny wedge-shaped cuneiform script, each mark whispering some kind of do-or-die commandment. Hammurabi, Babylonian king, and serious overachiever, etched over 280 laws into this thing around 1750 BCE. And, let's be honest, his idea of a reasonable punishment was a bit dramatic. Did someone steal a goat? That's a fine. Did someone falsely accuse their neighbor of goat stealing? That's a death sentence. It's like the penalties were written after a particularly bad day. You read down the list, squinting as you try to follow the eye for an eye pattern. Literally, if a builder constructs a house that collapses and kills the owner's son, the builder's son gets executed. Harsh doesn't even begin to cover it. There's no insurance policy here, only an extremely personal version of quality control. Here's your mainstream fact. Hammurabi's code wasn't the oldest set of laws, but it was one of the most comprehensive and one of the first to declare that the law applied to everyone, except, it didn't. Noblemen, commoners, and enslaved people all received different versions of justice. Same crime, wildly different consequences. Equality under the law was a slogan waiting to be invented. Now, for a fringe tidbit, some laws addressed river-related trial methods. For instance, if someone was accused of sorcery, yes, sorcery, always a favorite, the accused would be tossed into the Euphrates. If the river took them, they were guilty. If they survived, the accuser was put to death instead. So in ancient Babylon, swimming lessons might have literally saved your life. Historians still argue whether these river trials were symbolic rituals or actually practiced en masse. Were they formal courtroom procedures or just occasional scare tactics? The Euphrates isn't talking. As you step back from the cold stone monument, it occurs to you just how obsessed early civilizations were with public order and incredibly specific rules. Hammurabi didn't just say, "Don't steal." He detailed what happens if you steal a plow during planting season, in a drought. On a Tuesday, it's like ancient legal zoomers wrote this thing, but you can't help but admire the thoroughness. Hammurabi wasn't playing games. He knew a society could crumble from the inside without structure or worse, without consequences. He may not have offered a gentle hand, but he did offer something that looked a little like fairness. If you squinted and ignored the death by drowning part, you pass your hand over the stele's cool surface one last time before the scene changes again. It's fading, but slowly, like a soft cloth wiping the chalkboard of time. The dusty heat lingers on your skin, and the shadow of justice, rigid, unblinking, deeply committed to revenge, follows behind you for a few more steps. You keep walking, soothed by the monotony of each footfall, and you think, did anyone ever beat the system? Or were people just always one goat, theft away from total ruin? Then you remember ancient civilizations weren't lacking in cleverness. There were loopholes, bribes, and dramatic trials galore. Some folks surely charmed their way out of trouble. Others, less charming, probably ended up testing their luck in the river. So next time you feel stressed filling out a tax form or appealing a parking ticket, just remember you could have been tossed in the Euphrates. The air grows cooler as you walk, the scorched stones of Babylon fading into soft sand and shadow. You blink again, and suddenly you're in Egypt, not the tourist version with bustling bazaars and camera-flashing crowds, but a quieter, older Egypt. The Nile glimmers nearby like a sleepy silver ribbon, and just beyond its banks lies a courtroom of sorts. But it's not what you'd expect. Tonight, justice will not be served with a gavel, but with a feather. You've stepped into the mythic realm of the ancient Egyptians, where law and morality weren't just social codes, they were divine. Every action, every breath, fell under the watchful eye of Ma'at, the goddess of truth. balance, and cosmic order. She wore a feather in her hair, but this wasn't a fashion choice, it was your final exam. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In ancient Egypt, they believed your heart would be weighed against Ma'at's feather after death. A light heart free of wrongdoing meant eternal peace. Sis. A heavy heart that meant your soul got gobbled up by a fearsome creature named Amit, a chimera made of lion, hippo, and crocodile parts. Basically, a cosmic paper shredder. But back in the land of the living, punishments varied. Theft might cost you your hand. Adultery could lead to a beating or public shaming. False accusations. They didn't end well either. But compared to Babylon, Egypt leaned a bit more, poetic in its legal flavor. Less bludgeon, more symbolism. You notice an official ceremony taking place near a temple, a man accused of tomb robbery, an especially dreadful crime in a society obsessed with the afterlife, is being interrogated. The trial isn't about his rights, it's more about appeasing the gods. The judge consults scrolls, a scribe records the details with calm precision, and incense curls into the air like a ghost stretching its limbs. And here comes the quirky tidbit in some Egyptian courts. Oaths were sworn while holding a sacred idol or even touching the earth itself. One account suggests defendants were sometimes required to swear by the pharaoh's toenail. That's right, the royal toenail. Imagine telling your grandkids you dodged execution thanks to a pinky toe. Historians still argue whether these rituals were symbolic flourishes or taken literally. Were these odd oaths ceremonial for the gods or just theatrics to terrify people into compliance? As you stroll past the courtroom, you can't help but marvel at the Egyptians' duality, deeply spiritual, yet not above some bureaucratic creativity. They managed to mix cosmic law with surprisingly practical bookkeeping. The scribes, for example, wrote down every punishment, every confession, every sandal lost in the courtroom meticulously. If you tripped over your words during sentencing, you'd better believe someone logged it. You imagine the fear of being judged not only by a court, but also by a deity after death. It adds a level of pressure no modern judge could match. Sure, you might walk free today, but Ma'at is always watching, and she's a lot harder to bribe. As the scene softens, you trail behind a group of mourners heading to a tomb. They carry jars of wine and bread, a nod to the soul's eternal picnic. Someone drops a feather. It drifts down beside your foot. You don't touch it. Not yet. Instead, you walk on, the sand shifting quietly under your feet. Justice in ancient Egypt had many faces, some divine, some frighteningly mundane. Either way, you'd better keep your heart light, or at least avoid the pharaoh's toenails. You drift from Egypt's calm precision into a place far less poetic, ancient Greece, but not the polished, marble-pillared Greece of philosophy and democracy. No, tonight, you wander into its messier alleyways, where punishment is public, inventive, and uncomfortably theatrical. A salty breeze brushes your cheek as you arrive in Athens during its classical period. Citizens crowd a dusty plaza where a man stands on a raised wooden platform. His tunic is slightly disheveled, and despite the late hour, the crowd seems very much awake. They've gathered not for a debate or a play, but for one of Athens' lesser-known exports, creative civic humiliation. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Athens prided itself on law and order. Trials could be lengthy affairs, decided by large juries, sometimes up to 500 citizens. But when verdicts were rendered, the punishments were often very public. No prison cells tucked away behind closed doors, no quiet fines slipped under the table. No, Athenians wanted their justice visible and occasionally humiliating. You find yourself squinting at a strange contraption nearby, a wooden collar, wide enough to fit a neck, locked in place. That's a pedestal of shame, not a poetic name, but certainly effective. The convicted were forced to stand immobilized. exposed to heckling and sometimes rotten olives. It's justice with audience participation. And now for the quirky tidbit, one punishment reserved for idle citizens or gossipy troublemakers was being forced to parade through town wearing a radish, yes, a large root vegetable inserted in a rather undignified location. It was meant to shame, not maim, the ancient Greeks. It turns out, could be surprisingly inventive when it came to deterrence. Historians still argue whether such bizarre penalties were commonplace or exaggerated later by comedic playwrights and moralizing Roman writers. But the references persist, scattered through drama and satire like half-whispered gossip. You walk farther and see a man scrubbing graffiti off a wall under watchful eyes. His crime, insulting the wrong philosopher. In Athens, verbal insults could land you in legal trouble. Freedom of speech, sure, but only if you weren't slandering someone important. Call Socrates an airhead in public, and you'd best be ready to defend that opinion, formally. Athens also had a form of exile called ostracism, where citizens literally voted someone out of the city for 10 years by scratching their name on a shard of pottery. No trial, no appeal, just a vote. You imagine your neighbors deciding your fate over lunch, debating your usefulness between bites of figs, and there's another odd practice if you fail to vote or refuse jury duty. Public officials could punish you by dragging you through the agora with a dyed rope. Anyone caught with the telltale dye on their clothes was fined. Justice via fashion faux pas. As you pass the rows of men discussing politics under olive trees, you feel the sharp edge of peer pressure woven into the justice system. It wasn't just about law, it was about maintaining image, dignity, and civic duty, which, for the record, sounds exhausting. The sun has long set, but torches flicker in the agora. Somewhere nearby, a boy recites a speech he memorized for court. Even children here learned early in Athens, everyone's a lawyer. You mutter to yourself, no wonder the Greeks invented drama. And perhaps that's the clearest insight. Their punishments were extensions of their theater, a stage, a crowd, a moral to be learned. Justice wasn't blind. It was watching from the front row, probably with a snack. You take one last glance at the crowd and their unfortunate centerpiece in the shame collar. He sneezes. Someone yells, "Bless you," and the crowd laughs. It's justice, Greek style, equal parts performance, philosophy, and public discomfort. You step away from Athens's amphitheater of embarrassment and find yourself transported to a land with less drama and more steel ancient China during the Han Dynasty. The air thickens with incense and bureaucratic precision, and as you wander through a neatly arranged administrative compound, you begin to understand that here, justice isn't a loud spectacle, it's quiet, meticulous, and, if you're unlucky, permanently scarring. Under the Han Dynasty, roughly from 206 BCE to 220 CE, China developed one of the most sophisticated legal systems of the ancient world. They had criminal codes, civil laws, and entire officials whose only job was to copy legal texts by hand. That's your mainstream historical fact. This was not a lawless empire. It was an empire of ledgers, but justice wasn't exactly gentle. For many crimes, punishments came in 5 flavors, known as the 5 punishments, and not the light. Write an essay and reflect on your actions sort. These were corporal, often mutilating, branding, facial tattoos, amputation of the nose or feet, and sometimes castration. Yep, you stumble past a mural quietly depicting this hierarchy of discipline, and you're suddenly grateful for modern traffic tickets. Here's your quirky tidbit: branding wasn't just for cattle. Criminals in Han China might receive inked or burned marks on the forehead as a permanent reminder of their offense. The Chinese character for their crime: thief, liar, traitor, would be carved directly into their skin. It made facial recognition very literal and very unfortunate. You duck into a quieter corridor lined with bamboo slips, and catch snippets of administrative chatter. Officials are discussing whether someone forged tax records or merely made a math error. In Han, China, those two things could have wildly different outcomes. The former might lead to forced labor or exile. The latter could earn you a scolding and mandatory abacus training. Precision mattered. Yet, historians still argue whether these brutal punishments were as common as the laws suggest, or whether they were idealized deterrents on paper but rarely used in full. After all, there are records of families bribing local officials with fish, silks, or even poetry to reduce punishments. So, depending on your poetic skills, a criminal conviction could end in exile or a mildly annoyed scroll. You pass a courtyard where wooden punishment benches are arranged in rows. Here's where minor offenders might sit, tied down for public beatings. A lacquered paddle rests nearby. One scholar once joked that Han, China perfected the art of dignified discomfort. The punishments were designed to correct behavior, not to incite rebellion. Too much cruelty, and people stop fearing the law, they start fearing the government. There's also a strange contradiction at play. While facial tattoos and amputations were used, the Han were also obsessed with order, Confucian values, and familial piety. So, punishment had to fit within a system where obedience and honor were paramount. It wasn't about random cruelty, it was about restoring harmony, even if that harmony came with missing toes. And then there's the infamous punishment of exile to the frontier. If you were lucky or unlucky, you might be sentenced to live out your days building roads in a mosquito-infested swamp hundreds of miles away. One poet exiled this way wrote that he learned to love mud, because mud does not judge. You can't help but respect the optimism. You wander through an old archive, peeking at cases recorded on strips of bamboo bound with silk cords. They detail everything from tax fraud to arguments over land boundaries to one poor soul who was punished for walking with arrogance. The punishment, a fine and 3 public apologies, recited aloud in the town square with proper humility. You imagine stumbling through that speech with your pride duct taped down, and yet, despite the harshness, there were loopholes. Wealthy or well-connected families could sometimes pay a substitution fee, essentially buying their way out of mutilation with silver or livestock. Justice, as it turns out, has always known how to haggle. You walk past a sculpture of a Han magistrate, posed mid-lecture, one finger raised. He's not yelling, he's explaining. Because in Han, China, punishment wasn't just about pain, it was supposed to educate, to correct. You weren't just a criminal, you were a failed student of virtue. The night air cools around you, and the rhythmic tapping of ink brushes returns. Officials continue to document, calculate, and categorize. In this world, justice is a system logical, ordered, and sometimes terrifying in its efficiency. As you leave the courtyard, you glance back one last time at the lacquered paddle. It rests neatly beside a scroll that simply reads, "Reform begins at home." The world shifts again under your feet, and the air grows thick with the smell of date palms, incense, and hot sand. You find yourself in ancient Mesopotamia, somewhere between the Euphrates and Tigris, walking through a bustling marketplace in Babylon. Merchants call out prices, goats wander freely, and amid the everyday chaos of trade and chatter lies one of the earliest attempts at organized law enforcement, though calling it justice by modern standards might be generous. You pass a towering stele, the Code of Hammurabi, etched meticulously in cuneiform on black basalt. It's about 7 feet tall, and it radiates authority the way a terms and conditions page never quite does. This was one of the world's first written legal codes, dating to around 1754 BCE, and it covers everything from theft and marriage to business disputes, and you guessed it, punishment. Your mainstream historical fact: Hammurabi's code is famously strict and famously obsessed with bodily harm. An eye for an eye. That phrase comes directly from here. Break a bone. Yours might be broken in return. Destroy someone's farm equipment. Better hope yours wasn't made of soft wood. But here's your quirky tidbit. The code has a clause for river-based accusations. If someone accuses you of a crime but there's no proof, you both might end up in the river. Literally. The accuser throws the accused into the Euphrates. If you survive the river trial, the gods have judged you innocent. If you don't, well, Mesopotamian jurisprudence moves briskly. Historians still argue whether these river trials were regularly performed or if they serve more as terrifying deterrents. Some suggest only extreme accusations warranted such drama, while others point to records that hint at a disturbing frequency. Either way, it's hard not to be impressed by a system that involves zero paperwork and maximum splash. As you weave through a row of mud brick houses, you overhear a scribe muttering about a stolen ox. According to Hammurabi, if you steal someone's ox and are caught, you must return it and then pay 30 times its value. That's right, 30. Which means, in Babylon, livestock theft was less of a misdemeanor and more of an early retirement plan for the victim. But punishment wasn't meted out equally. The code was deeply stratified. If a noble broke a commoner's bone, he might owe silver. But if a commoner did the same to a noble, expect bodily consequences, in some cases, death. Social class didn't just affect your tax bracket, it could determine whether you kept all your limbs. And if you were a builder, hope your measurements were good. If a house you constructed collapsed and killed the homeowner's son, your son could be put to death as punishment. Yes, your son. Even the ancient Babylonians would admit quality assurance mattered. There's also a case of tavern owners, usually women, being punished for serving the wrong customers, particularly harboring criminals or not reporting rebellious talk. One punishment involved drowning in that same judgmental river. So imagine trying to run a bar, and the moment someone gets a little rowdy, your next step is trial by water. You duck into a shadowy courtyard where a teacher is instructing young scribes. They're copying sections of the law onto clay tablets with styluses, muttering the lines aloud in rote memorization. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. The classroom vibe is less schoolhouse rock and more medieval sawbones with homework. Despite the severity, the Babylonians did have appeals. You could bring your case before a judge or council of elders. The process wasn't always just, but it was deliberate. And if you had enough witnesses or could convincingly shift blame to someone else, you might walk away free. You imagine one man whispering, "It was my cousin's ox, I swear," and hoping the judges liked goat cheese bribes. Still, for all the cruelty, the laws also touched on fairness. If a debtor had a bad harvest, he might be granted a reprieve for the season. If someone accused you falsely, they could face the same punishment they wanted for you. It's the ancient equivalent of, "Are you sure you want to send that email? Night falls, and torches flicker to life." The city doesn't sleep so much as simmer quietly in the dark. You pass a wall where a tablet reads, "Justice is the breath of the gods." You can't help but think that breath must have smelled strongly of wet clay and mild dread. As you move away from the basalt stele, its words etched forever in stone, you reflect on how punishment back then wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about balance. You wronged someone, you got wronged back, sometimes spectacularly. Simplicity had a certain terrifying efficiency, a change of air cooler now, saltier, and tinged with cedar and olive oil. You find yourself along the rocky shores of ancient Greece, just as a wind from the Aegean picks up and rustles the linen tunics hanging on a line. Somewhere nearby, a philosopher is probably muttering about justice and virtue. But don't be fooled. This is not an era of high-minded fairness for everyone. Here, justice is as performative as it is punitive. You wander through the streets of Athens, past columns and crumbling amphorae until you reach the heart of civic life, the agora. Men stand in clusters, arguing politics, calling witnesses, and occasionally accusing each other of crimes. And then there's the punishment booth. Not quite a guillotine, but just as ominous. In Athens, legal matters weren't handled behind closed doors. They were a full-blown public spectacle, with citizen juries as large as 501 men. Your mainstream historical fact: in classical Athens, most crimes were tried by these massive juries, chosen by lottery. You didn't need to be a trained judge, just male, free, and over 30. Naturally, this led to some chaotic outcomes. Trials could be swayed by clever speeches or petty grudges, and sentences like exile or death could hinge on how persuasive someone sounded on an empty stomach. And here's your quirky tidbit. There was a punishment called the crypti, where misbehaving Spartan boys were forced to survive alone in the wild, armed with only a dagger, and sometimes even tasked with eliminating rebellious slaves as practice. Yes, that was less of a punishment and more of a Hunger Games internship. Historians still argue whether the crypta was a formal institution or a legendary exaggeration passed around campfires by older Spartans nostalgic for a time when knife-fighting teens were considered responsible citizens. But whether myth or truth, it says something about how punishment could blur into initiation. Back in Athens, one of the most oddly charming punishments involved large pottery shards. If you were deemed too powerful or annoying, think that guy who won every debate and wouldn't shut up. Citizens could vote to exile you using broken bits of pottery. Or ostraka. That's where we get the word ostracize. You weren't executed, just politely told to leave Athens for 10 years. Don't worry, they kept your property safe. Probably, you pass a small crowd gathered outside a building where a man named Socrates is about to be tried. His crime corrupting the youth and refusing to worship the city's gods. The sentence, death by hemlock. You watch as he calmly accepts his fate, which is very on brand for a man who annoyed people by answering every question with another question. That's ancient Greece for you. Invented democracy, sure, but also invented death by poison as punishment for being too philosophical at dinner parties. And then there's the theft problem. Steal in Athens, and you might be fined double or triple the value of what you took. But if you stole from a temple, that was sacrilege, and penalties range from severe fines to execution. Depending on how many gods were offended, the number of angry deities was basically a multiplier for your sentence. Down the coast, in Sparta, justice took a different form. Military, blunt, and soaked in discipline. Disobey your elders, expect whipping. Fail to meet athletic expectations. Public humiliation. The Spartans were not in the mood for nuance, and don't even think about being a halat, one of Sparta's enslaved agricultural workers. Every year, Spartans could legally declare war on the helots, a ceremonial way of justifying random violence to keep them subservient. Historians still debate whether this declaration was symbolic or a terrifying free-for-all. Either way, it's not exactly the kind of annual tradition you'd celebrate with fireworks. You pass a gymnasium where a group of men naked naturally discuss recent court cases while doing discus drills. One recalls a case where a man bit off another's nose during a fight. No mention of whether that ended up as an exhibit in court. Another chuckles about the time someone tried to bribe a juror and accidentally handed him the wrong coin purse. Oops, justice here is not blind. It's highly opinionated, prone to theatrics, and often driven by peer pressure. Trials aren't so much about guilt or innocence as they are about social standing, persuasive rhetoric, and whether you remember to wear your cleanest chiton that morning. Night falls over the Parthenon, its columns glowing in moonlight. Somewhere, a playwright scribbles down a tragic comedy about corrupt officials, knowing half the audience will nod in bitter agreement. You leave Athens through the Dippolon Gate, the sound of sandals on stone echoing behind you, and you can't help but think in ancient Greece, punishment wasn't always about retribution. Sometimes it was about maintaining social harmony, even if that meant poisoning your neighbor for being too clever with his metaphors. You follow a dusty road inland now, where the air turns warmer and drier, and every step crunches against brittle grass. The landscape changes, vast plains give way to baked hills, ochre walls, and massive ziggurats rising like staircases to the heavens. You've arrived in ancient Mesopotamia, land of scribes, stars, and a legal code so famously detailed it was etched in basalt for all to see. Welcome to the land of Hammurabi. At the city gates of Babylon, you're greeted not by guards, but by a looming stela covered in cuneiform. You squint. It's the Code of Hammurabi, chiseled with 282 laws and topped with a dramatic carving of the king himself, receiving authority from the god Shamash. Nothing subtle here. Justice comes straight from the divine. And the punishments, oh, they're very literal. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Code of Hammurabi, created around 1754 BCE, is one of the oldest known legal codes. It covered everything from contracts and wages to family disputes, and you guessed it, punishments. Steal something, you might have to repay it tenfold. Build a house that collapses and kills someone. The builder's own life might be demanded in return. Eye for an eye. That wasn't just a metaphor, that was the vibe. And your fringe fact, one law stated that if a man accused another man of sorcery but couldn't prove it, the accuser had to jump into a river. If he floated, he was guilty. If he sank and drowned, he was innocent. Not exactly great odds either way, kind of like an ancient version of trial by Yelp review, but with fewer survivors. Historians still argue whether these punishments were actually enforced or more of a dramatic warning. After all, there's a difference between inscribing "cut off their hand" and someone actually sharpening the knife. You wander into a market where merchants haggle over barley and goats wander into stalls uninvited. Justice here is extremely public. Disputes get dragged before elders or scribes, and your reputation is basically currency. Gossip holds weight, especially when it's written on clay tablets and filed in temple archives for eternity. No pressure. You notice a brickmaker nervously eyeing the structure he just finished. Turns out there was a law for that too. If a house collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's own son could be executed in return. You slowly back away from the building, very slowly. But Mesopotamian justice wasn't all retribution and eye removal. Sometimes, the punishment was a fine or a public apology. Other times, you'd be sentenced to work for someone else until your debt was repaid. Slavery as punishment wasn't uncommon, especially for those who couldn't cough up silver or grain in time. Oh, and here's a lovely one. If a wife was caught being wasteful or leaving her husband without cause, she could be thrown into the river too. Rivers were basically ancient lie detectors, conveniently silent and very final. Meanwhile, the temples held enormous influence over legal matters. Priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they often acted as judges, especially in cases involving temple lands or sacred oaths. You can almost hear one now, solemnly chanting legal formulas while a scribe scribbles furiously on wet clay. Now imagine you're a shepherd accused of letting your flock graze on another man's field. The penalty, compensation in grain, or maybe a few lashes if you're unlucky and the landowner has friends in high places. Not quite as dramatic as the river dunking, but probably more common. One punishment stands out for sheer specificity. If a tavern owner allowed conspirators to meet in their house and didn't report it, they could be executed. That's right, even back then. Nobody wanted their bar to become a political hotbed, unless you were looking to be sacrificed on a slow Thursday. As you stroll through the city, the scent of date wine and roasting lamb hangs in the air. Children chase each other past carts loaded with papyrus scrolls, and tiny bronze figurines. The streets are alive with color, and yet justice looming and unavoidable seems to press down on every rooftop tile. Some crimes brought creative penalties. For example, if a man struck a woman and caused her to miscarry, he owed her husband a set amount of silver. But if the woman died, then the man's daughter might be executed in her place. Scholars still debate whether this was literal or symbolic, or perhaps a chilling reminder that family was both your legacy and your liability. And if you're thinking, what about the gods? Oh, they were definitely involved. Oaths were sworn by gods like Marduk and Ishtar, and breaking one wasn't just a social offense, it was cosmic treason. Even animals could be cursed if they witnessed a broken vow. Imagine your donkey suddenly losing its appetite because you fibbed about barley prices. As twilight falls over the Euphrates, you pass a scribe smoothing clay, carefully documenting a court decision for future generations. Somewhere down the block, someone's plotting a minor revenge, perhaps scribbling a slightly exaggerated complaint about stolen oxen. Babylon never sleeps, and neither do its laws. You move on, dust in your sandals, leaving behind a city where justice was baked in clay, divine in theory, and sometimes just a little too creative in execution. The scent of salt sharpens in your nostrils now, mingling with incense, grilled fish, and sun-warmed stone. You've arrived in ancient Athens, where democracy is a newborn experiment. Philosophers argue in shaded courtyards, and punishments can be surprisingly theatrical or deeply peculiar. The agora bustles around you. Vendors shout over figs and olive oil, but in the corner, a crowd gathers near a wooden platform. Someone's being publicly humiliated with a radish. You blink? Yep. Welcome to ancient Greece, where punishment could come with a side of produce. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. In classical Athens, most legal matters were handled not by officials, but by citizen juries, often hundreds of them at a time. Everyone from philosophers to potters could serve. The Athenians believed in civic participation with gusto, which meant that justice was part courtroom drama, part neighborhood theater. And now your quirky tidbit, there are written references, yes, actual references to the use of radishes as punishment for certain indecent acts. Specifically, it was said that offending individuals might be subjected to a rather undignified radish insertion. That's not the kind of detail your high school textbook usually covers, but it absolutely comes up in ancient sources and scholar debates. Historians still argue whether this punishment was symbolic, satirical, or genuinely enforced. But before you worry about the produce aisle turning criminal, consider how most Athenian penalties revolved around fines, exile, and loss of status. The worst punishments were saved for those who undermined the state, like corrupt politicians, oath-breakers, and anyone accused of asabiia, or impiety. Socrates, for example, famously drank hemlock for corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. Not a great Yelp review for his teaching, but a very on-brand Greek ending. You stroll along marble steps as a trial unfolds outdoors. There's no judge in sight, just a speaker at a platform, gesturing wildly while a jury of hundreds listens. Everyone's a citizen. Everyone has a voice. You feel a little like you've walked into a philosophical flash mob. If someone owed money or broke a contract, they could be fined or publicly shamed for minor offenses. Athenians loved a bit of spectacle pillories, symbolic punishments, or even poetic ridicule. But Athens could turn harsh when its democracy felt threatened. Take ostracism. Once a year, citizens would vote on whom to banish from the city for 10 years. No appeal, no trial. They wrote names on broken pottery shards called ostraka and dropped them into urns. Sometimes the most popular or powerful figures were sent packing, just in case they were getting too cozy with tyranny. Think of it as preemptive cancellation, ancient style. Walking deeper into the city, you pass a slave tethered to a post with a branded mark. Slavery was common, and punishments for enslaved people were far more severe than for citizens. Whippings, forced labor, and shackling weren't unusual. Even within this cradle of democracy, justice wore different masks depending on your birth. Now you pass a small amphora shop. Pottery here isn't just decorative, it's documentary. Many pieces depict scenes of punishment, a thief tied to a post, a drunkard being fined, even mythical figures enduring eternal torments. Art, myth, and law all swirl together like olive oil and wine. And speaking of myth, the gods were known for handing down creative punishments too. Tantalus, forever thirsty with water just out of reach. Prometheus, chained to a rock with a liver-munching eagle on loop. These tales weren't just bedtime stories, they were moral warnings with dramatic flair. You know, like an eternal timeout. But with birds, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle debated punishment intensely. Was it meant to deter, to correct, to purify the soul? You imagine a toga-wrapped man pausing in mid-sentence, pondering the ethics of a public spanking. Not all Athenian punishments were grand or grotesque. Some were just weirdly bureaucratic. For example, if you falsely claimed citizenship, you might be sold into slavery. If you damaged public olive trees considered sacred, you'd be fined heavily or exiled. Apparently, nothing got Athenians fired up like bad arbor etiquette. The air grows warmer as the sun starts to dip behind the Acropolis. You hear lyres playing and smell roasted lamb drifting in from the hills. Still, even here in the twilight, the mood carries a touch of judgment. Everyone knows the laws, and everyone knows the risks, and yet there's an odd comfort in it. The punishments might be peculiar, the justice system clunky, but it was all part of a society trying to figure itself out, a place where farmers and philosophers debated ethics over figs, and where even being too rich or too persuasive could get you kicked out of town for a decade. As you leave the agora, you glance back at the wooden stage. Someone's reading a law aloud. The crowd nods, murmurs, moves on. Justice is never quiet in Athens. It's loud, public, and often a little absurd. But in a city of thinkers and dramatists, maybe that's exactly how it was meant to be. The dusty road beneath your feet leads you westward to the sprawling expanse of the Roman Empire, an empire famous for its roads, baths, and surprisingly inventive punishments. You can almost hear the clatter of sandals on cobblestones and the murmur of the Forum as the city wakes from its midday rest. Romans took punishment seriously, but often with a bureaucratic flair that feels oddly efficient. Picture this: you've been caught stealing a loaf of bread in Rome. Instead of a quick thumbs up or thumbs down from the emperor, you might find yourself subjected to a punishment calendar devised by lawmakers who love their schedules almost as much as their togas. First, a mainstream fact: Roman law was famously codified in the 12 Tables, dating back to the 5th century BCE. These laws laid the foundation for centuries of legal tradition and included surprisingly detailed rules about crimes and punishments, from property disputes to violent offenses. The Romans loved order, so they created clear, written consequences, sometimes to a fault. Now, for the quirky tidbit, the Romans had a punishment called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Instead of a simple execution, criminals, prisoners of war, and sometimes Christians were thrown into the arena to face lions, bears, or leopards. It was part punishment, part public spectacle, and part brutal entertainment. Though horrifying to us, this was considered a civic event, like a violent festival. Historians still argue whether these executions were as frequent or theatrical as later sources describe, or if some accounts exaggerated for effect. But what's clear is that Roman entertainment often blurred with punishment, a vivid reminder of power and control. For the average Roman citizen, punishments were often more practical. If you were a slave, and yes, many of Rome's residents were, you could be flogged, branded, or forced to fight as a gladiator. But citizens had protections, including rights to a trial, appeals, and certain limits on torture. Still, not all punishments were physical. Romans were fond of infamia, a loss of legal and social standing. Imagine being declared infamous and suddenly barred from testifying in court, holding office, or marrying freely. It was a slow social death, a permanent scar that could follow you for life. One particularly Roman punishment involved being sewn into a sack with animals, usually a dog, a snake, or a monkey, and then thrown into water. This gruesome-sounding ritual, called poena culae, was reserved for parricides, those who murdered close family members. You can't help but wonder about the origin of this curious blend of animal company and aquatic doom. Meanwhile, the Roman penchant for spectacle extended beyond executions. They used creative shaming punishments, like the tabulae, public tablets listing offenders' names and crimes posted in marketplaces. These were early versions of a wall of shame designed to humiliate and deter. As dust falls on the forum, you imagine senators debating laws while sipping wine, mixing politics with punishment policy. The Romans were practical, yet theatrical, firm believers in law and order, but also in showmanship. You pass a fountain where water splashes rhythmically, reminding you how even punishment in Rome was tied to civic life, public, visible, and sometimes a little bizarre. And in this empire that stretched from the cold north to the warm sands of Africa, justice was always a performance. You leave behind the marble columns and bustling streets of Rome, traveling now to the vast and mysterious lands of ancient China, where the concept of punishment was deeply intertwined with philosophy, order, and cosmic balance. Here, justice was more than law enforcement. It was a reflection of moral harmony, a way to keep society in sync with the natural order. The harsh clang of the magistrate's gavel echoes in your ears as you enter the Qin dynasty era. Around the 3rd century BCE, the Qin emperor, famous for unifying China and building early sections of the Great Wall, was also notorious for his strict legal code, one that prioritized harsh punishments to maintain order and discourage rebellion. A mainstream fact to anchor you, the Qin legal code prescribed severe penalties, including mutilation and forced labor, for a range of offenses. This was the age of legalism, a philosophy that believed people were inherently selfish and required strict laws and punishments to behave properly. But let's pause for a quirky detail: the infamous 5 punishment system. Unlike modern prisons, these punishments targeted the body directly. They included tattooing criminals' faces with ink to mark them visibly, cutting off their noses, or amputation of limbs. These weren't just punishments, they were lifelong stigmas, forcing the punished to carry their crimes on their bodies forever. Imagine being recognized immediately in a crowd, not because of your personality, but because of your nose or the lack thereof. Historians still argue whether the severity of these punishments was as widespread as ancient texts claim, or if some were more symbolic or used selectively to set examples. Some scholars believe the stories of widespread amputation were exaggerated to intimidate, while others think they were genuinely common in maintaining state control. Despite the severity, there was a surprising balance. Confucian principles advocating mercy and rehabilitation influenced local magistrates, leading to some cases where punishments were softened or replaced with fines or forced labor. You get a sense of a tug-of-war between harsh state control and more humane ideals. Then there's the quirky practice of exile to distant regions, which, although less physically harsh than mutilation, was a severe social punishment. Being sent hundreds of miles away from family and friends was effectively a slow, lonely punishment. You can almost feel the chill of distant mountain winds as exiles began their journey, hoping they wouldn't be forgotten. In the quieter provinces, punishments were often inventive. Criminals might be forced to wear wooden collars with inscriptions describing their crimes, public shaming without physical pain, a precursor to the Roman tabulae. The legal system also had a unique way of involving families in punishment, sometimes penalizing relatives for the crimes of one member, reflecting the Confucian value placed on family responsibility. It's a reminder that in ancient China, personal guilt often extended beyond the individual. As night settles over the forbidden city, you're left contemplating how these punishments were more than just penalties. They were woven into the moral fabric of society, designed to maintain a delicate balance between control and harmony. Drifting away from the ornate courts of China, you find yourself wandering the sun-drenched lands of ancient Egypt, a civilization that believed the afterlife was just as important as life itself, and punishments often reflected this cosmic outlook. Picture the buzzing market squares of Thebes or Memphis, where merchants barter fragrant spices and papyrus scrolls rustle softly in the breeze. Justice here wasn't only about immediate consequences, but also about cosmic order, or ma'at, the balance between chaos and harmony maintained by the gods. A solid historical fact to hold on to. Punishments in ancient Egypt range from fines and beatings to forced labor, and occasionally imprisonment, though prisons were more like holding areas for debtors or political prisoners than long-term facilities. Now for a curious quirk, some petty criminals were sentenced to forced labor on massive construction projects, like the building of temples or pyramids. But unlike the popular image of slaves, many laborers were paid workers, sometimes even seasonal farmers, supplementing their income during the Nile's flood season. The lines between punishment, work, and survival blurred gently in this context. Historians still argue whether harsh punishments were the norm or if Egypt's legal system was more lenient and restorative than often portrayed. Some evidence suggests that most offenses were resolved with fines or community service, aligning with the value of social harmony. Public shaming played a unique role. Criminals might be paraded in front of crowds wearing signs detailing their offenses, a practice oddly reminiscent of medieval Europe's stocks, but with a gentler tone, almost theatrical. Interestingly, the concept of punishment after death also loomed large. Egyptians believed the weighing of the heart ceremony, where one's soul was judged against the feather of Ma'at, could condemn a person to oblivion if their earthly deeds were too dark. This eternal consequence arguably kept people in line more effectively than any physical punishment. In daily life, you might overhear whispers of how scribes meticulously recorded crimes and verdicts on papyrus scrolls, showing an early form of bureaucracy, though these records were not always public. This hidden ledger added a layer of accountability without the loud spectacle. You might chuckle imagining an ancient Egyptian version of a dunce cap. Some criminals reportedly had their heads shaved as a mark of shame, a mild yet humiliating punishment that would make modern students nod in recognition. Through the dusty streets and grand temples, it's clear that punishments in Egypt weren't just about pain, but about reinforcing a cosmic order and social stability. Even their humor had a gentle bite, reminding offenders that their missteps were noted in the grand ledger of life and afterlife. Crossing into the sprawling deserts and lush oases of the ancient Arabian Peninsula, you settle into the quieter world of Bedouin tribes, where punishments were often tied to honor and community survival rather than state law. Imagine yourself sitting around a fire under a star-studded sky, the warm crackling of flames mixing with soft murmurs of stories and judgments. One mainstream fact: Bedouin justice was typically swift and personal, administered by tribal elders or councils, relying heavily on oral tradition and social pressure rather than written codes. Blood feuds and compensation payments, known as diya, were common means of settling disputes and punishing wrongdoing. A quirky tidbit here is that certain offenses, like theft, might result in a peculiar ritual. The guilty party could be symbolically banished by having their camel taken from them, a punishment as painful as it sounds for someone whose livelihood depends on their animals. Losing a camel was like losing a limb in the desert. Historians still argue whether the concept of honor killings, often associated with later periods, had roots in early Bedouin punishments or if they're exaggerated by modern interpretations. Some scholars suggest that tribal justice was far more focused on reconciliation and maintaining social cohesion than outright violence. You might smile at the idea that poetry, a cherished Bedouin art form, occasionally served as a medium for public shaming or even punishment. Offenders might be the subjects of sharp verses recited around the campfire, turning social ridicule into a powerful deterrent. Daily life in these tribes was delicately balanced. A harsh punishment could upset this balance and risk splitting the tribe. So, elders preferred solutions that restored harmony. Think of it as ancient conflict resolution with a sprinkle of desert wisdom. Remember how in earlier sections we discussed public shaming in Egypt and medieval Europe? The Bedouin approach was quieter but just as effective, relying on communal memory and respect for tradition. Sometimes the threat of being spoken ill of was enough to keep people on the straight and narrow. As you listen to the crackle of the fire and the cool night air, you appreciate how these desert punishments blended practicality, culture, and a deep understanding of human nature, much less about spectacle, more about survival and honor. You wander now to the wind-swept steppes of Central Asia, where nomadic tribes roamed vast grasslands, their horses galloping freely beneath wide-open skies. Here, justice and punishment took on a form shaped by mobility and the harshness of nature, a far cry from the stone courts of ancient cities. A mainstream fact is that among the Mongols and Turkic peoples, punishments were often meted out swiftly by tribal leaders or khans, with a strong emphasis on maintaining the tribe's unity and strength. The famous Yasa Code, attributed to Genghis Khan, included strict rules, but enforcement was practical rather than theatrical. A quirky tidbit involves the punishment for horse theft, a crime almost equivalent to stealing a person's lifeline. Thieves could be subject to a curious penalty, forced to ride a stolen horse backward for a day as public humiliation, a spectacle witnessed by the tribe, discouraging future thefts while sparing bloodshed. Historians still argue whether the Yasa was a formal written law code or an oral tradition passed down by word of mouth. Some say it was a mix of both, evolving with the Khan's needs. This debate colors how we interpret Mongol justice today. Imagine yourself sipping tea in a felt tent, the soft clatter of hooves outside, as elders discuss disputes quietly. Punishments were designed to be harsh enough to deter, but not so severe as to weaken the tribe's manpower, a delicate balance in a world where every member mattered. Remember the Bedouin camel confiscations? Here, mobility meant that punishments needed to be immediate and effective, often involving public shaming or loss of property, rather than long, drawn-out legal battles. You might chuckle at the fact that, according to some accounts, minor offenses could be resolved by the offender delivering a heartfelt song or poem, turning justice into an almost artistic affair, a soothing balm to restore harmony. The cold winds outside whisper of a justice system deeply entwined with survival, respect, and the rhythm of life on the steppe, a far cry from the brutal spectacles of the Roman Colosseum or medieval European stocks. As your journey through the world of ancient punishments winds down, you find yourself back in the quiet corners of history, where laws and penalties whispered stories about societies and their values, from the deserts to the courts, from whispered tribal songs to public shaming rituals. These methods of justice were as varied as the landscapes themselves. You reflect on how punishments, while often harsh by today's standards, were normal and necessary tools for maintaining order in communities where survival often hung by a fragile thread. In some cultures, the line between discipline and cruelty was thin, while others preferred more symbolic or restorative approaches. A lesser-known fact floats to mind in parts of ancient Greece. Some criminals were forced to wear masks, depicting their crimes, a gentle but vivid reminder of their misdeeds. This blend of shame and theatricality gave justice a human face, quite literally. Historians still debate how much these punishments shaped social cohesion versus simply enforcing the ruler's power. Were these practices about community healing or control? The answer is often tangled in cultural context. Lost in the murmur of time, you settle deeper into your pillow, the sounds of history fading into a comforting lullaby. Remember the crocodile dung sunscreen from earlier chapters? Odd details like these remind you that history's oddities are what keep it alive, gently tickling your curiosity without disturbing your calm. Now, as the final images of distant courts and nomadic steppes fade, let the weight of the past dissolve softly around you. Justice, in all its ancient forms, was part of the human story, a story that hums quietly beneath the surface of your dreams. Sleep well, knowing the world once spun to rhythms quite unlike today, yet familiar in its quest for fairness and order. Slowly, you feel the pace of time itself begin to soften, as if the sun is dipping just below the horizon of your thoughts. The harsh clang of ancient punishments mellows into a distant echo, wrapped in the warmth of evening's hush. Your breath slows, deep and even, like the calm after a storm of stories. Imagine the flicker of candlelight dancing on stone walls, the quiet murmur of a village settling to rest, the gentle rustle of a breeze through olive branches. These images fade gently, folding into the softness of your mind. No need to rush. The world can wait as you drift further into peace. Let your muscles unwind, releasing tension carried through the day. Feel the weight of the past settle lightly, like a soft blanket tucked around you. The odd, fascinating details you've heard, the backward horse rides, the poetic punishments, the masks of shame linger only as a kind curiosity, a gentle lullaby from another time. As your thoughts grow quiet, remember this journey was not about fear or shock, but about understanding the rhythms of human life long ago. These stories whisper that, no matter the century, we all seek calm, order, and connection. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let the night carry you into dreams wrapped in history's soothing embrace.